we're extremely honored and excited to kick off this year's edition of the World Tax Summit with renowned world speakers who will be expressing what they see as the lessons arising from previous crises and to share the relevance of these ideas in the context of COVID-19. So they accepted very generously to present what they see as the major economic and fiscal ideologies that shape tax policies over the past century and to share their vision of the future regarding tax policy. So joining us first is Madame Mariana Mazzucato. Madame Mariana Mazzucato is a doctor, PhD. She holds the chair in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London. She is also the founder and director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. IIPP is dedicated to rethinking the role of public policy in shaping both the rate of growth and its direction, and training the next generation of civil servants with a focus on the dynamic organizational capabilities required for mission-oriented policies. Madame Mazzucato is also the winner of the 2014 New Statements Sperry Prize in Political Economy, the 2015 Hans Mathopier Prize, and the 2018 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. Madame Mazzucato was named as one of the 3 most important thinkers about innovation by the New Republic. She is also the special advisor of the Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, and the OECD's New Growth Narrative. So pleased to welcome her to share her ideas, and she will be joining us.
Hello, I am Mariana Mazzucato, and it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you about my ideas about tax policy and its relationship actually to our theory of the economy, our theory of value, and how wealth creation comes about. So first of all, I'd like to begin with the basic fact that the economy has not just a rate of growth, but also a direction, and how we design tax policy affects both the rate and the direction. And there I think it's also important to start with some first principles, which is what is the economy? And we often confuse, for example, the concept of the market with business. We might hear the word, the state versus business, or what is the role of the state and the market. And really, the market itself, we need to be careful when we use that word. Markets are outcomes. Markets are outcomes of how we actually govern different types of actors in the economy that co-create value. And that means how we govern a corporate sector. So the concept of corporate governance, there's different ways to do that. There's cooperative models around the world. There's models based on shareholder value maximization. There's, of course, also the concept of stakeholder value maximization. And all those are about different ways to govern a company. But there's also very different ways to govern the public sector. In economics, we often pretend that the public sector is there to simply fix market failures, but actually how you set up a public institution can be governed either through that notion that you're there to fix a market failure, so you actually have to wait for markets to fail to actually then intervene in any which way, whether it's through taxation or investment. But there can also be different types of governance structures. For example, I've been advocating for quite a while, and I'll come to this also at the end, that a more interesting way to govern public institutions is through an explicit admission that actually public actors are co-shaping and co-creating markets, not just fixing them. So that will determine the remit of an organization, whether it's the BBC or a Department of Energy, the organizational culture, again, if you're there just fixing or co-creating. But also there's other actors in the system, of course, in the civil society area. So labor unions, trade unions have been absolutely fundamental over the history of capitalism in terms of, again, shaping market outcomes. So the fact we have a weekend, the fact that we have an 8-hour workday, didn't occur just due to government or business, but it occurred due to struggles and social movements, and in particular, in that case, the trade union movement. So really what markets are, they're outcomes of how all these different organizations are internally governed, but also how they interrelate one to another. And that, again, concept of stakeholder value has to do just as much with, for example, how a company is governed within, but also how different actors in the economy interrelate one to another. And I just like to say that because I think the concept of the market is often, again, confused with the concept of business. Businesses are important. They're one of the types of actors in the economy that are very important, but they are not the market. The market is, again, an outcome of how business, public sector, third sector interrelate one to another. So back to that first point of the economy having not just a rate, but also direction. What is then the effect of tax policy on that? In a short amount of time, I cannot go into the details, but let me just kind of review some of the basics, which I'm sure you all know, but it's important, I think, just to lay it out. First of all, if we want to have a direction for the economy, for example, that's more inclusive, that's more sustainable, that's able to target really ambitious goals like the Sustainable Development Goals, or if we look 50 years ago, getting to the moon and back again, tax policy can actually help design a system that steers the economy in that direction. In fact, back to that point about, co-shaping and co-creation of markets, one of the roles of the public sector should actually be, in fact, to help us achieve some of the big outcomes that we want, whether it's the Green Deal or getting a man to the moon, actually a woman now, of course, to the moon and back again. And so, if we want a green economy, of course, we should be taxing, materials more than we tax labor. We should be fostering long-term growth over short-term growth, and especially long-term growth that brings us more sustainable types of production structures. You can, for example, also, reduce tax for those companies that are making commitments towards particular types of carbon emission reductions. But also, if we want a more inclusive economy, of course, we should have more progressive and less regressive taxation. Some regressive taxes are, for example, rises in VAT, or a flat tax, because they, in a relative way, are penalizing those with lower incomes more than those with higher incomes. But also, again, this is all very obvious, but, a reduction in the top marginal income bracket, of course, will not get us inclusive growth. So those are just kind of very broad points there. But again, the directionality of growth, if we want it to be more inclusive, more sustainable, one can, again, design a tax policy that moves us in that direction. And that's why I also believe that it's important for the concept of policy to be, again, more about co-creating, co-shaping, but also not using this kind of old-fashioned language of leveling the playing field. Those examples I just gave are actually about tilting the playing field towards a particular type of direction: inclusion, sustainability, or again, all the different targets that might be under the Sustainable Development Goals. They might also require some basic design of tax systems in that way. And, currently we don't have these very interesting tax systems. So, for example, the fact that we still have no financial transaction tax, or that capital gains tax is quite low, too low, I would argue, in many different countries. Both of those, facts are actually rewarding in some ways short-termism over long-termism. And you can imagine that if you, make a capital gains tax structure much more granular, then you can be fostering more long-termism. And it was quite curious that in the UK, it was actually under a Labour government, which usually tries to, bring more progressive tax structures, but it was under the Labour government that they decreased the time that private equity had to be invested from 10 years to 2 years to get a tax reduction. And that only, increased the short-termism of that particular financial sector. Anyway, so those are all issues around direction. On the rate, I think one of the issues is it really depends on what your theory is of investment, of business investment. So if we want to increase the rate of growth, one of the key levers that governments have, whether it's, through grants, loans, procurement, and taxation, one of the key points is then to crowd in actually business investment. You'll know that GDP can be broken down into different ways, and one of the ways is through demand. So government demand and investment around, the things that government produces, whether it's bridges, roads, schools, and hospitals, business investment, consumption investment, and net export. So C plus I plus G plus X minus M. X minus M is net exports. And, it was John Maynard Keynes who was very clear that one of the big problems with output, national output, so GDP, is that the investment part, business investment, is very volatile. It's very unstable across the business cycle, but it's also too pro-cyclical. Too much during good times, too little during bad times. So one of the key, points of government is to be counter-cyclical, so that when business is withdrawing its investment during bad times, government perhaps should be increasing its investment in order to get the economy back on track. But the other point there is that if business investment is too low, government needs to be thinking through what to do to actually increase business investment. In other words, not just making up for business investment, but really stimulating, catalyzing, creating additionality on the business investment side. And so in terms of tax, what can government do? And unfortunately, there's this myth that business already wants to invest, and all that government needs to do is make it cheaper. So whether it's reducing corporate income tax or introducing different types of indirect tax incentives, whether it's an R&D tax credit or something else. So let me just take both of those in turn. There's very little evidence that reducing corporate income tax will increase business investment. What it surely does is increase profits. And that's not the point of government. Government, again, is not in the business of increasing profits, but increasing investment, so which increases output, which increases employment, which over time, if done correctly, can also increase productivity and so forth. But just increasing profits is surely not its goal, or should not be. And by the way, we actually are living through a period right now where the profit share is actually at a record level. So there's really no problem with the profit share of GDP. The real issue is how do we actually make sure that in different periods, especially in a period like we're living through now with a health pandemic, or during a recessionary period, or in a period where we just might need more business investment, again, in a particular direction, that government can help make that happen. And so this assumption that business already wants to invest and you just need to make it cheaper, and that all of a sudden that will stimulate business investment, unfortunately, we simply don't see that in the data. Instead, what we tend to see is that when government makes more ambitious investments itself in new areas that really foster kind of the perception by business leaders of where future opportunities might lie, whether that's developing a whole new technological area like biotech, nanotech, the internet, which of course came out of government investments, well, then business often follows. So using these direct investments, not indirect tax incentives, but direct ambitious investments in high risk, high growth opportunity areas, then business investment follows. And we call that crowding in. And once you do that, once these direct investments do increase the perception in the business community of where future opportunities might lie, then on top of that, of course, designing a well-designed tax incentive might increase the marginal investment. But we don't really see tax incentives creating additionality, in other words, making investment happen where it wouldn't have happened anyway, unless, again, it's actually preceded by these more direct investments. And this is really important because otherwise what happens is you might have ideas that simply by introducing an R&D tax credit, somehow the spending on R&D, the investment on R&D will go up. And again, we don't really see that. We only see R&D tax credits having an effect when they are also complemented by and often preceded by government investments in bold, high-risk, early-stage R&D, which then crowds in a business R&D. And similarly, a patent box kind of policy, which is a tax policy which reduces taxes on profits generated by patents, doesn't really make much sense. Also, just logically speaking, patents are already monopolies for 20 years. There's no real reason, a monopoly that government is granting the private sector. There's no reason that that you should also then reduce the tax on those monopoly profits. The incentive to get business to innovate has already occurred by giving a company a 20-year monopoly profit. So again, both R&D tax credits, when they're not complemented by direct investments, and the patent box policy tend to, again, simply increase profits and not investment. And so that's just something to be aware of, which doesn't mean you don't need R&D tax credits. In fact, in Holland, they have introduced a smarter, I think, way of doing tax credits on R&D, which is based not on the profits generated from the R&D, but the labor actually hired, and the additionality there, again, is greater, but it's really across that whole portfolio of different instruments that one must evaluate what works, what doesn't, and this kind of real importance of direct government investments to actually create those perceptions in the business community is quite important. Now, the other issue is, given the importance of these public investments, what do we know about that? And what's interesting is, public investments have been very important for exactly, all the things that make my technology, my iPhone, smart and not stupid. So the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, that was all public money that made those investments or that funded business to make those investments, but it was tax funds that allowed that to happen. Similarly, something like 75% of new molecular entities with priority rating, so in the health innovation area, are outcomes of this very bold public investment worldwide. In the US, the government spends over $40 billion a year on health innovation through the National Institutes of Health, but also here in the UK, where I'm sitting, the government spends a lot, as do charities. And so here what we really need to understand is, coming back to my earlier point, that value is co-created by both the private sector, of course, but also these public entities. Tax policy here is also interesting, not only in terms of stimulating business investment, which I've already covered, but also making sure that the public sector is getting its fair share for what it's actually also invested in. And so the fact that, the same company, Apple, which benefited massively from public investments in the technology, as I mentioned, the internet, GPS, and so on, the fact that it then actually has used, as so many, unfortunately, so many companies have done, using tax evasion policies, not paying back their fair share, that really kind of adds insult to injury. So in the case of Apple, they actually transferred one of their subsidiaries from Cupertino, California, the proper headquarters of Apple, to Reno, Nevada, with zero tax rates, simply, again, to avoid their tax bill, and saved, obviously, a lot of money along the way. Similarly, in the health area, Oxfam, a couple of years ago, put out a great report called Prescription for Poverty, showing just how much the big pharmaceutical companies, so Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Merck & Co., et cetera, have used different types of tax dodging maneuvers to save close to $4 billion a year. And again, this is in a sector which has benefited and continues to benefit massively from public investments, which of course then suffer when these companies are not putting back into the public purse their fair share of tax. And so, I do think this is, even more important today than ever. We're living through a health pandemic. We need strong global health systems. And so the taxes that not just the pharmaceutical companies pay, but all the different companies pay back into the system, a system which they benefit massively from these social investments that are made through different types of actors in the economy, is more important than ever. One of the reasons, again, this is, I think, very well showed by the Oxfam report, but it's quite common sense. It's public education, public transport, and public health that suffer the most when we have this tax evasion. And I found it quite optimistic, if you want, to see that some countries are currently actually taking this on quite seriously in terms of the conditionalities that are being put into the recovery funds. So in Denmark, for example, the recovery funds that the government's providing businesses in this very difficult time. So of course they do need, help in order to survive, but those recovery funds are conditional that the companies not be using tax evasion kind of activities. So if you're using tax havens, you cannot access the recovery funds. And I think that's absolutely right. Macron, the president of France, also introduced conditionalities in terms of coming back to the issue of direction of growth. He said that companies like Renault in the automotive sector and Air France and airlines would not be able to access the recovery funds that France provided unless they committed to reducing their carbon emissions. So again, this issue of conditionality is quite important right now, as we want to not just get over this very difficult financial economic moment, but actually build back better, build back a more sustainable system, a more inclusive type of economy. And here also it's very important to look at conditionalities in terms of what public and private are doing together. So the race for the vaccine, very important project, lots of different experiments happening out there, but we need to make sure that it's very clear what we want. It's not just a vaccine. It must be a vaccine that is universally available and accessible to the population globally. And that means that we need to govern the innovation process very carefully, both in terms of that tax revenue, but also in terms of how we govern the intellectual property rights, which unfortunately are often abused, but also the prices, having to really take into account that public contribution, and too often they don't. So, for example, the therapy that Gilead is putting out called remdesivir for COVID, it actually received $70 million from the US taxpayer, and yet Gilead is charging $3,200 per dosage, not taking into account at all what citizens have already put in. So these are really important issues. We actually wrote through my Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose a report on these issues 2 years ago called The People's Prescription, which, if you're interested in some of the health innovation issues, I recommend you read. But lastly, I do think that rethinking tax has to be accompanied, as I've been basically arguing, by rethinking the narrative of where wealth comes from, where value comes from. And I deeply believe that value is created collectively, that, again, markets are outcomes of how we govern different organizations in the economy and how they relate one to another. And it's very hard to get a more progressive taxation system if it's not underpinned by a real belief that, you know, we have the ability to really foster the capabilities and opportunities across the whole economy, across many different actors in the economy, to build, you know, a better system. And so I hope these words have helped provoke some thoughts at your conference. I'm sorry I cannot be there. And thank you very much for listening to me.
His fame goes back to the mid-1970s when he demonstrated that too much tax kills the tax with the now famous Laffer curve. The Laffer curve has influenced a global tax reduction movement since the 1980s. During this decade, Mr. Laffer also served as senior advisor to the Reagan administration from 1981 to 1989. He has also advised President Donald Trump on his campaign for the presidency of the United States in 2016. On June 19, 2019, President Donald Trump awarded Laffer with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions in the field of economics. Mr. Laffer is the author of several books, including The End of Prosperity: How Higher Taxes Will Doom the Economy If We Let It Happen, published in 2008, and nominated for the F.A. Hayek Book Award in 2009. He is also the author of Return to Prosperity, published in 2010, and Bloomberg Businessweek selected the Laffer curve as one of the 85 most disruptive ideas in our history for its 85th anniversary issue in 2014. And so we're honored to have him here to share with us his vision and insights on the future of tax policy. So here's Mr. Laffer.
Let me just start off with government, the role government should play in an economy. You know, there are three things about government: how they spend, how much they spend, how they tax, how much they tax, and the total level of government spending. When you look at taxes, remember, all taxes are bad, but some taxes are worse than others. What you want to do with government taxation is you want to collect the revenues in the least damaging fashion possible, which is usually a low rate, broad-based, flat tax is the ideal tax. So you provide people with the least incentives to evade, avoid, or otherwise not report taxable income. And you give them the least places in the tax code where they can put their income and avoid paying taxes. All right, that's the tax. Now, spending, on the spending side, what you want to do is spend the money in the most beneficial fashion possible. And that includes all sorts of things other than straight economics, helping the poor, social spending, all of that sort of stuff as well. When it comes to the total level of government, what you want to do is, when the damage done by the last dollar of taxes collected is a less than the benefit done by the last dollar of money spent, you stop already. That is the optimal level of government in a society, in an economy. Any spending and taxation higher than that is too much. Any spending and taxation that's lower than that is too little. What you really want to do is have the ideal level of tax spending, et cetera, in the economy. Now, it's not only taxes that matter, but spending restraint is also very important. These are the 5 pillars of prosperity: taxing, spending restraint, sound money. There's nothing that can bring an economy to its knees faster than hyperinflation and an unsound currency. You also want to have minimal regulations. We all know we need regulations, but what you want to make sure is that those regulations don't go beyond the specific purpose at hand and create collateral damage in the overall economy. And lastly, you want free trade. There are some things that we produce better than foreigners, and there are some things foreigners produce better than we do. we and they would be foolish in the extreme if we didn't sell them those goods we make better than they do in exchange for those goods they make better than we do. These are the 5 pillars: taxation, spending, sound money, free trade, and minimal regulations. Now, looking at crises of government, I've been involved with the White House here in the United States for about 50 years. I was in the Nixon White House in 1970. I was George Shultz's right-hand person back then. And I've been in almost every White House and involved with every White House since that time. And let me start. We had a panic situation in the Nixon White House in 1971. And let me just say that whenever politicians are faced with a crisis, they almost always react in a panic fashion. If you look at it, whenever politicians make decisions, when they are either panicked or drunk, the consequences are rarely attractive. The case in point in Nixon was in 1971 when he came down from Camp David on August 14th and read the tablets, devalued the dollar, took America off gold. What he also did was he put on a 10% import surcharge on all products. He had something called the Job Development Credit, which was a tax credit for only American-made capital, not for foreign-made capital, totally wrong. And then he put on wage and price controls as well. This was a very bad decision made by Nixon, and it caused a lot of damage to the US economy. Nixon, that wasn't his only mistake. A little bit later, as some of you may remember, there was something called Watergate. There was a break-in at the Watergate Hotel in Larry O'Brien's office, who was head of the Democratic Party. It was a bunch of guys, 5 people, I think, total, that broke in. When Nixon was told of this, he decided to cover up. What he should have done, very simply, is just say these guys were working for the committee to re-elect the president. They were not following orders. They did something illegal. They should be prosecuted. But no, he didn't do that. He tried to cover up, and you had the Watergate, which was, again, a huge problem created by the response to a crisis, just the way the devaluation was. Jerry Ford, I was very involved in this with Jerry Ford as well. Nixon left office, Jerry Ford came in, he had something which he called whip inflation now. There was inflation, which is a 5% tax surcharge. That was the situation where I sat with Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, talking about that, you know, you have a 5% tax surcharge, you're not gonna get 5% more revenue. You might get 4% more revenue, you might get 2%, but you're not gonna get 5% more. And in fact, you may actually lose revenues. That's when I drew the Laffer curve on the napkin, the famous one at the Washington Hotel, the W Hotel there in Washington, D.C. That's another panic decision by a president. If you look and go to Jimmy Carter had the, you know, there was the Arab oil embargo on the United States, and Jimmy Carter panicked. He put on the National Energy Plan, which what that did was wellhead price controls, which meant that no Americans pumped oil anymore. Put on pricing oil, gasoline below market, which meant that there were huge gas lines, huge disruption in the U.S. economy. And then he put on tax surcharges, which is called excess profits tax on companies, which caused an enormous distortion in the economy as well. Again, a panic. Now, you finally get to Ronald Reagan. By the way, Jimmy Carter also made a huge mistake from panic. We had the American hostages caught in the embassy in Iran, and Jimmy Carter tried to do a secret invasion with helicopters, and you may know that turned out to be a major catastrophe because it was a panic decision made without carefully considering all the consequences that would happen. Under Ronald Reagan is the only president I've ever seen that did it correctly. In 1982, 81, we passed the tax bill, which phased in tax cuts. The tax cuts fully took effect on January 1st, 1983. Now, if you know tax rates are going to be cut next year, what do you do this year? You defer all the income you can this year and the next year, and by deferring the tax cuts, Reagan caused a real decline in the U.S. economy in 1981-82. All the people around him were begging him to get rid of the third year of the tax cut, all of this stuff. And Ronald Reagan's comment at that time was, I was not elected to raise your taxes. I'm going to stick with the tax cuts that I have. And he did. And as you know, on January 1st, 1983 on, for the next year and a half, the U.S. economy grew at 12%, or at an 8% per annum rate, which is Chinese growth rates. The right decision was do nothing in that case. Also in 1987, Reagan was faced with a huge collapse in the stock market. And that huge collapse in the stock market, everyone is trying to tell Reagan to do these panic moves and all of that stuff. And instead, Reagan did nothing. I mean, Reagan did nothing. The stock market recouped its losses. The economy continued on in prosperity. In fact, it was a great, great period of prosperity. Reagan is the only one who really followed the correct dictates, I believe, for what policy leaders should do. You know, the first thing is when you look at a policy, think of the Latin phrase primum non nocere. First of all, do no harm. Make sure that the policy you're putting in does not harm the economy. And the second one, which I loved of Reagan's, he had a very neat way of placing it, but it's vis medicatrix naturae, which is the healing power of nature. In Reagan's term, he said, don't just stand there, undo something, which is really lovely. Get rid of taxes, cut government spending, reduce regulations, all of that stuff which Reagan did. And that's why his full 8 years in office were so successful. When you get to Bill Clinton also did a very, very good job on running the economy. He faced crises in areas not in economics. I think throughout his whole period, the economy did well. I voted for Bill Clinton, by the way, twice. I thought he was a great president and did a terrific job. As you may remember, he got rid of the retirement test on Social Security, which was a unique tax on elderly workers. He did welfare reform, where you actually have to look for a job to get welfare payments. He cut government spending as a share of GDP by more than the next three best peacetime presidents combined. I mean, it was just amazing. He cut the capital gains tax. I mean, he was a really terrific president. And as such, you saw the Reagan prosperity dip down with H.W. Bush and then proceed nicely. H.W. Bush raised taxes. He behaved in a panic session. He didn't have a moral compass on how to run economics. And then you look at, of course, W and Obama. And I'm going to stop after W and Obama. W and Obama faced a major crisis, starting with the very tail end of Bill Clinton and then going down. Both of them made huge mistakes by thinking the government can solve the problem. You know, when you look at government is not the solution. Government is the problem. And by invoking all that stimulus spending, which does nothing but make things worse, and then Obama raising taxes throughout that process, we had the worst recovery in U.S. history after Obama's thing, the worst recovery, because they all tried to. Let me just say that the real problem with government people is they want to do something. And you know, when a crisis comes, that is when it's most important to take a deep breath, be calm, be collected, composure is really important, and think the issue through. Almost all of the real crises in the US have come from bad responses to a crisis, to something happening outside. Now, with COVID-19, there's not much difference in that. The US panicked. We had a $3.6 trillion CARES Act. Some of it was good. Some of it was stimulating medicine research and that type of stuff that was good. Some of the payroll protection plan was good. Some of the underwriting by the Fed to guarantee loans. You know, one of the problems you have when you have a crisis is to make sure that liquidity problems don't morph into solvency problems. And as such, the Fed did a great job in guaranteeing loans of solvent companies, but they went way too far. They protected companies that were already insolvent beforehand and just gave away lots of taxpayers' money. But, you know, that was a panicked response that I thought went way, way, way too far. But since that time, you know, we have been very, very careful. We've cut tax rates. Trump has cut tax rates dramatically, proposed additional cuts in tax rates, has gone through with transparency in medicine. So I think this administration and the Reagan administration have been the two best administrations with respect to how to respond to a crisis. But let me just say, from my perspective, whenever a crisis hits, take a deep breath. Do not rush policy actions. Don't. Take your time, think it through very carefully, and remember the 5 pillars of prosperity: tax policy, government spending, monetary policy, trade policy, and regulatory policy. And what you want is a low rate, broad-based flat tax, spending restraint, sound money, free trade, and minimal regulations. And with this as being the goal, the really way a good government should operate is to be calm, cool, and collected, and lead in a very careful way, not be the person who creates the panic itself.
So thank you very much, Mr. Laffer, for sharing his thoughts with us on tax policy. We are now moving to our next guest. Mr. Vito Tanzi holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University, completed in 1967. He taught economy at the George Washington University and at the American University, where he was department chair in 1970 until 1973. Mr. Tanzi was also at the IMF for some time. He was head of the tax policy division from 1974 until 1980, and he was then the director of the fiscal affairs department, still at the IMF, from 1981 until the year 2000. From 2001 to 2003, Mr. Tanzi was Undersecretary for Economy and Finance in the Italian government. He has been a consultant for many international organizations, most recently with the United Nations. Mr. Tanzi is the author of many books and articles in economic journals, such as the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, the Review of Economics and Statistics, the Journal of Public Economics, and many others. There is also an economic effect known as the Tanzi effect, whereby real tax proceeds are eroded during periods of high inflation, and this effect was, of course, named after him. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. Vito Tanzi.
I want to thank Professor Pepin for the invitation. My talk is about taxation. I've written a background paper which gives more details on what I'm going to say, but I'll summarize the paper as well as I can. Taxation is clearly the major tool that governments have available for their economic policy, and governments are the main institution that the citizens have available to promote their collective goods. In the last century, the scope of what government should do was expanded considerably. It came to include not only the allocation of resources, that is the production of collective goods, of public goods, but also the redistribution of the income and the stabilization of the economy. However, the theory of taxation has normally been developed by experts in connection with the normal times, not in connection with the catastrophe or pandemics, no? And unfortunately, future pandemics or future catastrophes are difficult to predict or to forecast. Therefore, it is difficult for democratic government to allocate the resources to them. If they did, they very often would lose elections, and enterprises that allocate major resources to the future would lose the competitive game, because they deal for the next election, the government deal with the next election, and enterprise deal with the competitive equilibrium market. However, catastrophe and pandemics do come occasionally, unexpectedly, very often, and they require some reaction and some attention. You know, in the case of business cycles, which are one kind of problem or catastrophe sometime when they become Great Depression. In the case of business cycles, when they became more regular or more frequent, then government were beginning to react to them. We have the Keynesian revolution, and we have what were called built-in stabilizers, which were introduced by government to make the economy more resilient to business cycle. In this connection, a comparison between American enterprise and Japanese enterprise is very interesting. You know, it's mainly for the reaction of private enterprises. In Japan, private enterprises, they take precautionary balances of their profits. They keep them aside. So when a recession comes, they don't have to fire their workers. In the US, the American enterprise, they don't think twice about firing the workers. The bottom line that in Japan, the unemployment rate fluctuates much less than it does in the US. You know, it's interesting that if you look at the current pandemics and now we go to the current pandemics, the most, well, maybe I should make a premise that most workers depend for their standard of living on their wages. When they lose their wages, it's a great problem for them. On the government, on the other hand, rich people do not depend on wages. They have assets, and assets are very often distributed in many baskets, so that normally they don't have the same difficulty that the workers have. And well, the current pandemics has been quite strange and quite unusual in the sense that it has not been neutral across income classes. It has been a disaster for what are called the essential workers, and it has been almost a bonus for rich people. The stock markets have been booming, especially in the US. They are at a record high, and so there's really a disconnect in between what has happened to the two groups, and this doesn't cast a good shadow on market economies. Make the market economy look very, very unfair. And well, what are the reasons for this disconnect? In part, they are past policy on the tax side and policy on the monetary side. On the tax side, if you look at the data, they are really extraordinary. If you go to 1944, the marginal tax rate in the US for rich individuals was 94%. This rate kept coming down over the years, and now is only 37%, which is much, much lower. So if you were a billionaire or a millionaire in 1994, you paid a lot of taxes. If you are a billionaire now, you don't pay much more taxes than the average workers. At the same time, the compensation of CEO, the managers, for example, this is another really extraordinary data. In 1965, it was 20 times the average of their workers. They earn 20 times more than the average workers. By now, by 2017, probably it has increased even more, was 312 times. So this has been a major, major change in the economy, in both taxes and compensation. The tax rate on corporation had been 52% in '69, and it is now in the US, it's only 21%. So many incentives for enterprises were also introduced over the years, so that people today talk about corporate welfare. There are many corporations that pay very little taxes, and of course their shareholders do very, very well, and unrealized capital gains are not taxed, so one can become very rich and in this environment. Globalization also has introduced a major difference. It has made possible for many people, many corporations, and many rich people to avoid taxes. A clever advisor can tell them what to do, how to make the money and put the money in places where the tax rates are zero or very, very low. So all this has created really a new world. Well, what about the monetary side of it? It's interesting also that the central banks, they don't feel that they have the goal in their mandate. There's nothing about equity. There's only about stabilization and things like this. And so equity does not enter. So they have created this incredible expansion in credit. And this expansion has allowed corporations and very rich people to access money at a very, very low rate. On the other hand, if you are a normal person, a normal citizen with a small business or need a loan from a bank, we are still paying very, very high rate. We hear about 25% rate on credit cards and 18% rates on other borrowing. So we are in a world which has changed dramatically, much more than people have come to realize. So the question now what should the taxation be in this period? And I'll be very brief. I cannot go into details to summarize. Well, first of all, I want to make the point that pandemics are not the best time to make major tax reform. If you want to reform the tax system for normal times, this is not the best time. So that if whatever tax changes a country should make at the moment should focus on the pandemics and not on long-range problems. Now, what tax changes could be introduced? Well, during wars in the past, during the Second World War and others, normally taxes were introduced on corporation, excess profit taxes, on the assumption that corporations were making excess profits, and on very rich individuals. The marginal tax rate, as I said, was pushed to 94% in 1944. So that really the taxes should try to bring about more equity in what is happening in the economy. They should try to share the burden. And the main taxes to introduce would be one on wealth, on some level of wealth, one on the very, very high income, and maybe a Tobin tax, a tax on transaction, that because of the way that the stock market has been doing very well, they would not even be felt. So this is really the bottom line of my paper. As I said, there are much more details in the paper that I've written. Thank you very much.